He also did a cover version of an old Yardbirds, a 60s kind of a pop rocking band. The Yardbirds, they had originally a song from the 60s, a kind of hit from them, a song called Shapes of Things. Moore did a heavy metal version of that in 1984. But Moore was clever with cover versions. He'd pick an artist, given that Moore was kind of into the metal with this album. Moore could pick a song that was kind of different to his style and make it into a kind of metal song for the 80s. He turned Shapes of Things, and he had a kind of a hit with it as well, into a contemporary metal song for the 80s. He changed the tempo and the arrangement to make it a different song. Moore had the attitude, there's no point in covering someone else's song unless you can better it. A lot of people that did covers, they were just doing things, especially when you see in the world of heavy metal, some heavy metal star of the modern age, and he does an old heavy metal song, too faithful to the originals, and it's not as good. Moore would pick a different kind of a thing and do maybe a heavy metal cover in the 80s of a 60s song, and it sounded like a kind of a new song. You know what I mean? Yeah. That kind of way. Victims of the Future, after that, then he released a live album, We Want More, from that tour in October 1984. Gary Moore as well did a great performance at the Major. It's called Download now. The Major in August 1984. Before the end of the tour, around the end of the tour, he finished off with a major gig. He was about, we'll say, fourth up from the top. He was a bit down from the top, but he was still way up in the bill. Castle Donington Monsters of Rock, the annual in Donington Town, Central England. He played the annual heavy metal festival there, like, you know what I mean, that kind of way. Other things as well. While he'd sing everything on that record, he had a good fella in his band as well, a British musician called Neil Carter. And this fella was probably one of the greatest, as a backup musician in Gary Moore's band. He was probably the greatest jewel in the crown that Gary Moore, as we'll say, Victims of the Future progressed into the late 80s. This fella, Neil Carter, was probably this fella has to be mentioned, because he was probably the greatest jewel in the crown as a backing musician that Gary Moore ever had. As Gary was saying, I sang everything on Victims of the Future. Neil Carter, a British rock musician, he came in from a legendary British hard rock heavy metal act called UFO that had been there for years. Neil Carter could play keyboards, rhythm guitar, and he could also sing backing and lead vocals as well. So if they were on, we'll say, as Gary says, if I get sick of singing live on stage, Neil Carter, I can let him sing. And then if on a record, I want to do a heavier track, I feel that keyboards aren't really needed, I can get Neil to play keyboards on a track that I want. And if I don't want keyboards, he needn't play at all. But I can get him, if it's a metal song, I can get it, or if it's a hard rocking song that's all guitar, when we go live on stage, I can get him to play rhythm guitar. If I get sick of singing every now and then during the show, if I want to break and just concentrate on lead guitar, I can get him to play rhythm guitar or keyboards and sing as well. And the weird thing about it, as Gary Moore said, Neil Carter's voice was quite similar, which it was true. I heard a live tape. Neil Carter's voice was quite similar. So Gary Moore says live tapes that they recorded, sometimes they'd be playing it back and it's hard to know which one was which was kind of weird, you know what I mean? Gary Moore would continue commercial success. In 1985, he'd release an album called Run for Cover. There's actually a funny story I can tell you about that album.
What? I'd like to hear it.
Starting Run for Cover in the early part of 1985. Could I borrow a fag?
You can borrow a fag, no problem.
Gary Moore, being a great fan and the legendary Glenn Hughes. The legendary Glenn Hughes, like, you know, of formerly with a legendary band, Glenn Hughes, the one of the greatest British bass player vocalists ever. Formerly with a 60s band called Trapeze, Glenn Hughes made his name as kind of like singer with David Coverdale in the legendary Deep Purple Mark III. Hughes had also did some great solo albums, and he had done work with a legendary, he had released a great kind of mixture of soul and rock with a legendary British guitar player called Patral, as we call him, with the flat Tipperary accent. In 1982, Glenn Hughes would join Gary Moore's band in the early part of 1985. Basically, it was, any chance we can cut it? I am busting for a leak.
Okay, right.
And can we get back to it again?
Yeah, no problem.